Yep.
All right. POI's verbal once again, and I'll preferably take one from closing, but if not, opening is symmetrically fine. All right. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. We were both young when I first saw you. I closed my eyes and the flashback starts. I'm standing there on a balcony in the summer air, see the lights, see the party, the ball goes. As romanticized as love it sounds, unfortunately, on the side of opening government, we will never subject individuals to the fickleness and the arbitrariness of love, and to never allow it to dictate the hollowed constitution of marriage. For that, we're immensely proud to propose 3 points of framing before I move on into one argument as to why definitely that we need to oppose love as a prerequisite for marriage to incur. First framing then, what is this debate about? We believe it is about whether or not the narrative actually leads to more harm and good, and whether or not a world in the absence or the presence of this narrative is preferable. Second of all, then, what is the world of the dominant narrative in the status quo, i.e. the world of the opposition, looks like in this debate? We think it looks like it is a world that is for love to be a prerequisite or a condition that is a necessity for marriage to occur. To believe that in the absence of love, that marriage cannot manifest, and the marriage that exists cannot be sustained. Third of all, then, what is opening government's counterfactual, and what is the world we support, we prefer in the absence of this narrative? We prefer a world to which we think there's a couple of characteristics to apply to this world, to which we prefer a world in the absence of this narrative. The first is that we suggest marriage can still happen on our side of the house, and it can still involve love, but does not have to be a precondition to exist. Second is that we suggest you can have marriage of conveniences, i.e. drop together for economic constraints, when you have economic constraints, drop together to have a better economic life, etc. But last of all, it looks like marriage being a long-term commitment to be made for other reasons, things like companionship, things like tax breaks, and etc. Having that framed, moving on to the first argument in terms of why we need to oppose love as a prerequisite for marriage. The first thing I want to characterize is what exactly is love. We suggest that love is a feeling that is fleeting and is feeling that is fickle. The love that is usually defined by pop culture and other cultural icons during the dominant mainstream of society. This looks like Hollywood. This looks like the romanticization of love in Hollywood, where Hollywood makes it seem as if it's streamy and it's a bed of roses, that it's the most angelic thing you can potentially imagine and you can potentially envision in this particular wide world. That is the most beautiful thing in this world, that in the absence of your partner, that your world will be rippled apart. We think that is a world that they have to support, to which individuals actually can find and opt into the solidarity of this particular narrative. There are a couple of impacts that follow by that we think is indestructibly detrimental towards as individual beings in this world. The first is that we suggest people make emotional and irrational decisions when they fall into love, when they opt into relationships actively in love. I think there's a couple of things right here. First is that they're unable to perceive the long-term harm that exists. If you love someone, but unfortunately they're not economically capacitated, or they're not economically privileged, then the point here is that when a financial crisis strikes, when something unpleasant or is unpreferable in the future that might occur to you, we think the factor is that you're going to struggle to deal with those obscurities and those unfortunate realities in the future. But second of all, you end up in a torturous relationship because there's the societal stigma against divorce that exists in the status quo. That the moment in which individuals can find and resort to the word or to touch upon the word of divorce, that are ultimately shamed and shone upon in their side of the house. So the point here is you end up in a constant and vicious cycle of suffering with little to no viable alternatives to opt out. The second harm right here is that we suggest you would rather deprioritize other factors that constitute but rather important competence to construct a successful marriage. Things like stability, things like compatibility, things that are likely to make a long-term relationship last to the very end. We say we increase the likelihood of success in the art city house the moment in which we prefer a world that is not confined and is not dominantly premised upon the word of love. We say we best empower individuals on our city house. Comparatively, individuals in our that are more likely to prioritize things like financial security. Things like, for example, things like emotion, things like stability, and things like whether or not this person is trustful to begin with, even if it is not, that in the way we do not prioritize love. Having it established, the third harm right here is that within the narrative of love that suggests us in a world of opposition is that if you love someone, you would literally do anything boredom. The characterization here implies that it includes putting up with toxic and negative behaviors to which you're likely to subjugate you as an individual yourself to on your side of the house by virtue of love. We think this is immensely detrimental, particularly to you as an individual entity, because it disproportionately affects the individuals who are comparatively vulnerable, individuals like women, individuals that think they can fix a guy's problems the moment and slowly indulge themselves with the religion of love. We say the moment to which these forms of arbitrary situations that you subject and consent to is the moment to which you put yourself and subject yourself to abuse for years and years of periods of time in their side of house. Because of this, they are unable to opt out. But the reality here is that the narrative empowers and worsens and abuses on their side of the house, because people think that marriage lasts forever, that marriage is eternity, and love will justify all kinds of horrific and horrible things that might come into place. But we also suggest that a narrative creates pernicious incentives for people to stay in abusive relationships for a longer or extended period of time. Even if they are able to opt out at the very end of the day, realize they're more likely to opt out faster on our side of the house. And this is a comparative value that we're able to get, because the moment to which you opt out of the abusive relationship faster is a moment to which, number one, you're more likely to be equipped with a capacity to attain and to be in a state of exploration for the very next particular person that might be the love of your life. But second of all, you ultimately detach and disassociate yourself from the harms abusive to begin with. We say this fundamentally is important to you as an individual entity, because you yourself is the most important component that you can rely on at the very end of the day. Before we move on, I'll take a few from closing, if there's any.
Cool. Why is it that people won't divorce on your side of the house to the point in which you have nothing lasting?
We don't think divorce is a harm right here, which I'll explain right now. So in the absolute word, we'll just explain right now, so it's like a very clear transition. But before this, touch a little bit more. So the point here is that you worsen the harms they go through on your side of the house, but at best you mitigate that on our side. So in response to the PO right now, so even to the absolute worst case, when divorce does occur on the side of opening government, we suggest it's still better, because to the very least, you might not have a love to loss. You might have the particular emotional attachment to that particular person, where if you rip it apart when you actually divorce, we think it's comparatively better in our side of the house, because there isn't such a sufficient, or that isn't such of a great magnitude of love that is you actually invest into that particular person. But lastly, we suggest is the harder or the more you love someone, is the more it is the painful when the relationship actually ends, especially if it ends prematurely on their side of the house. That is why conclusively on all of these grounds, we've proven as one opening government that we best protect you as an individual entity, but we also barricade minorities and particularly vulnerable actors like women from the very constitution of harms that a marriage or a toxic relationship can incur. We're very proud to replace.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. May we have the Leader of Opposition?
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay. Let me just fix my notes. I'm doing this POIs through chat. I'll most likely take one between 4 and 6 minutes. Preferably from closing. Pronouns are he and him. Wait. I'll just set my timer. All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3. Wait. In 3, 2, 1. The absence of loves bring a disproportionately larger lack, a void in people. Now, before I start, here's some two keys of framing. Firstly, love changes the way you act, because our actions are determined by our state. And I don't see any contention from opening government, since they say like it makes us do irrational decisions and the likes. And for example, when we love someone, we may do irrational decisions, but it also makes us like stay with a partner. It also makes us do wonderful gestures. Basically, it makes us like stay for the family and a lot of things. Now, what does a lack of, however, the inverse is also true. A lack of love also changes the way you act, especially in families. For example, the lack of love may cause you to be cold and distant towards your partner, even towards the child you've made with your partner. It may influence you into doing abuse and a lot of other things. Basically, love or the absence of it changes the way you act. And secondly, families is the like basic building blocks and therefore shape society. Now, I have two arguments for this round. Firstly, firstly that wait, can't find that it worsens the household, the family, when you take love out of the equation, and secondly, that people are more secure in a world where which love is a necessary condition for marriage. But before that, just one rebuttal. Previous speaker said that love is feeling that's fleeting and fickle, which is bad because it makes you do a variety of ugly things. However, this is kind of false also, because love has always been contested. It's not always fast and fleeting. Even in Hollywood, it's not always like shown in that way. It can either be fast or it can be lasting, as with the one shown in the Notebook, which makes the person like even which makes the person like always do anything for the one he loves. Also, it does make us do irrational things at times, but it also makes you do wonderful things, like in staying with someone not necessarily perfect for them and for your children. Now, moving on to my first argument, it worsens the household, the family, when you take love out, because three premises for this. Firstly, the natural goal of marriage is to make children and raise a family. Secondly, children are largely influenced in their earliest years because these are the years where they're most vulnerable, so they have to adapt to follow their parents and to let them mold them. And thirdly, children follow their parents' example due to like the mirror neurons, which naturally makes them do it, and because their parents are their only role model in those years. Now, what happens in the status quo where marriages have love? Firstly, the parents like raise a child, of course, and the child derive their values from them. They treat others when they grow up how their parents do, because, for example, their partners. A relationship tends to be like determined by how our parents treat each other. So when they're cold and distant, you'll perceive that to be how relationship works. So when you grow up, even if you're not aware of it, tend to treat your relationships as very much cold than is normal. In this world, like children learn to love others because they see this love from their parents and especially in their future partners. However, what happens on government side? They see the lack of love in their parents and perceive it as the norm. So they won't show love to others. They won't like be good to them. They won't give them flowers and they won't stay with them just because that's what the lack of love do to them. And even if like the mom and dad loves the child but not each other, this will still be bad because this is still they still show the child an incorrect way to treat someone, and all future partners are still worsened by this. And it's worse because it's a natural thing to feel love and security from our family. However, in government side, they don't have this because the children don't ever feel safe from their parents, whom are cold and distant and who may even beat and whose father even may even beat their mother up. And we can draw a parallel with this from single parents, where the child doesn't know how to love and become like reckless and like bad. So what is the impact of this? Firstly, is that we damage every single child from marriages in three key respects. Firstly, they don't feel safe nor loved in their own family. Secondly, their future relationships are compromised. They don't know how to love them, how to treat them, and they'll be distant and they have more chance of breaking up. And thirdly, personal issues like attachment may ensue. And second impacts that society at large is compromised, since it will be full of these impassionate people who don't know how to treat each other right. Second argument is that people are more secure in a world which love is a necessary condition for marriage. So what do we mean by security? Security is the mental state of feeling safe and taken care of around your romantic partner or around your spouse. We think that security is only achieved when love is established within the relationship as a necessary condition before getting married. So why is this true? There are three structural considerations. Firstly, if you're married to somebody who doesn't love you, then you are bound to that psychological pain of feeling unwanted. Humans naturally want to be cared for and feel safe around those they spend time with. This is why we pick friends we like being around who are toxic, and this is why teenagers run away from their homes when they do not feel like loved by their parents. This inherent need to feel loved by people you spend the most of your life, which cannot be ignored for the rest of your life. When you are married to someone, you share bank accounts, you share private information, and the like. This means that the more time you spend with each other, this means that the more you spend time together, knowing that your spouse doesn't love you, the more that your emotional needs as a person are not met. This is even worse on the opposition side because you will stay married to people who do not love you and continue to spend time with them because society dictates that love is not necessary for a lifelong partnership. At least in opening opposition, people are inclined to protect themselves and divorce their spouse who does not make them feel loved. This is an exclusive value of emotional security because the dominant narrative allows them to prioritize their emotional needs as an individual over the contract of marriage itself. This is how we break the deadlock on abuse because opening government frames that love is predicted to be forever in a marriage. But in opening opposition, we think that it's good to emphasize love is necessary for marriage because without feeling love, women are more likely to leave these abusive, loveless marriages. A second and third consideration will be tackled more by my partner for all the reasons stated. We've never been prouder to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Maybe now have Deputy Prime Minister to extend the opening up case.
All right, great. So CJ, no preference for pronouns. If you want to chat, refers to engage closing. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Mariah Carey proved herself wrong when she said, "I can't live without you," and sometime later proceeded to divorce her husband through a messy and very public divorce. Opening Government rejects the glamorized definition of what Hollywood thinks the world, what love looks like, and it being the prerequisite for people to enter legally recognized long-term committed relationship, and instead prefer the counterfactual, where people opt into marriage on less volatile factors other than love, which is not the dystopian reality that opening opposition characterizes, or better yet, not opt into love at all, not opt into marriage at all, which like in many cases is like, you know, a shackle in a prison that we don't think is particularly good. I want to talk about a few things in this speech. The first thing is why love as a prerequisite for marriage is fundamentally something that's harmful. And I want to directly challenge the feeble lack of response to the leader of opposition as to what love actually looks like. Then I'll weigh this against the absolute worst case on our side of the house and still explain why the lack or the absence of this narrative is preferable. Then I'll talk about the comparative from Dela's side, and if I have time, talk about an extension on children, directly flipping Dela's point. So, love as a prerequisite for marriage being something particularly harmful. We think that love is very fundamentally based on emotion, right? It's a collection or amalgamation of different hormones that you have that gives you the emotional rush of feeling high, that you really are in love with someone else, want to spend the rest of your life with them. We think that pop culture describes it as such, like Hollywood, all the common theme in all the story, right? Boy meets girl, falls in love, they get married, they have kids, which is the ideal nuclear family held as the ideal, especially in like Judeo-Christian values that underpin a lot of the Western liberal democracy that predominantly dominate popular culture through things like neocolonialism and stuff like that. The only response from the LO here to say that Hollywood doesn't always characterize love this way without ever explaining what this looks like or why that is likely to be the case. Because I just think it is just true to say that the predominant narrative in Hollywood, right, is to have like love stories with happy endings for everyone involved. It is the predominant theme in like K-dramas also, right? You fall in love, then you got inevitably you'll have like a love triangle somewhere, and they got big discussion about what the girl should do and stuff like that. All the various love songs that exist in popular culture, and all the people professing their endless, undying love, you know, like often weeks and days before their relationship ends, is everywhere. We should just suggest that it's just more likely to be true that popular culture endorses and ascribes love in this particular way, which means that when you weigh the likelihood of what's going to happen, it is more true to say that people are going to buy into this idealistic concept of love, especially those who are young, those who have very little experience and are often making decisions that are going to affect them for the rest of their lives. So I think people want to be sold the dreamy love story. It is the dominant narrative that has held true for decades, and it's in line with the incentive of Hollywood producers to consistently and continuously produce stories in this vein, because that's what people want to be fed. It is the idealism that, like in many cases, is just unrealistic, but people choose to believe it and consuming it anyway. That means that the people who are opting into relationships fundamentally are opting on an idealistic version of love that is not realistic, but they don't know it until they go through that relationship. And at that point, it's too late because harms have already been done. They're not stuck in a relationship, you know, that is like loveless fundamentally, where they find it difficult to leave, they feel trapped, they're pressured to put up with all kinds of horrific behavior in the name of loving someone and like self-sacrifice and all that crap like that. It is something that we fundamentally reject in opening government. But Op says, the absence of love means that your emotional needs are not met. Like, think about this. At no point do they ever explain why love means your needs are going to be met, right? The most toxic and abusive relationships are those where one or both partners genuinely think that they love each other and they put up with the toxicity, even though it spills over to their children, to everyone around them. So it's unclear at this point why the value of love as a prerequisite necessarily means that your emotional needs are going to be met. But the second thing we'll say is that the absence of the narrative does not mean your emotional needs are not going to be met, right? And here's what I kind of want to do with the comparative. But before that, I just want to flag at this point that even if it's true, there's some harms to the absence of this narrative. It is uncomparative to the fact that outside means people are more likely to make better decisions, like marriages of convenience, for example, that are based less on fickle emotions, but more on rationality, things like compatibility and whether you're going to last for the long term. It is far less likely to be abused because if your partner is like abusive to you, you're just going to leave that relationship because there's no such thing as this idiotic concept called love binding you to that specific relationship. All of these things mean that you are comparably better on our side of the house as opposed to the world where this narrative holds true in this point in the debate. The second thing on this speech, I want to talk about what is the comparative, right? Like the Elo's dystopian characterization of like loveless marriages is just as depressing as it is unrealistic. It's like, children are going to be stuck in relationships where parents hate each other and don't talk to each other at all. Like in that specific context, I want you to ask yourself, why don't these parents just leave those marriages in the first place? Because it's possible for you to leave marriages in outside of the house. In fact, I'll argue it's easier for you to leave marriages in outside when you don't have this like artificial concept of love that's binding you there. So I think it's very unrealistic to say that people are going to be stuck in this specific relationship. But I just also want you to weigh this against the counterfactual, where we have explained what the narrative that love, binding people to relationships creates all kinds of different problems. It is unclear why this is a worse harm. Like if your parents just don't like each other and they don't talk to each other, there's ostensibly still a better world for these children as compared to the comparative here. The second thing we'll say here is that the alternative is just unlikely to be the dystopian reality. We think it's much more likely to be people either opting into long-term relationships on the basis of like long-term compatibility, which means that those relationships are just more likely to work out in the long term because we have like shared interests, shared values and stuff like that. But it also means that people may not choose to opt into those long-term relationships at all in the first place, and they prioritize their freedom and their agency to do anything that they want. The good thing for women as well, because they have greater agency to choose and empower their career instead of being tied down with a relationship. So I just think that the counterfactual is better for all the stakeholders involved. See you, go for it.
Cool. Presumably these people enter because of material safety, which means that leaving that relationship will probably decrease the material safety. Why would they leave?
Material safety? So like, in the case where that's true, that kind of exists symmetrically, right? Because like if you enter a relationship for love as well as material safety, then you also kind of like find it difficult to leave. But the second thing is that I'm not sure why you have to enter a relationship for material safety. You can enter on the basis of just like mutual interest and shared compatibility. I would say in a world where like women are becoming increasingly empowered to join the workplace and have their own source of income, I just don't think material safety is specifically an important reason why you will enter a relationship outside the house. The final part of the speech, I want to talk about why like loveless marriages are horrible for children. And off the bat, I'm happy to accept there are plenty of marriages built on love that raise functional children, but there are just as many relationships that are initially built on love that fall apart when that love fades and parents no longer see the value in staying together. Whether they stay together or whether those parents choose to leave and divorce, children are irrevocably harmed by a divorce during their childhood or by parents constantly fighting and taking their anger out on their kids and the people around them. The point here is that the harm on children is immense because it's irreversible trauma inflicted upon children at a very young age, which hurts you as an individual, your self-esteem, you're more prone to toxic behavior, and you take out all your problem on people around you and greater society. The absence of this narrative just means that children are not to be abused in the first place, which means we protect a key important stakeholder. If you don't buy everything else I've said, this is an independent path for OG to win the round.
I thank the speaker for that speech. May we have the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off the top half.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Thanks. Hi everyone, name is Arielle. POI preference is through voice. I'm not gonna be looking at the chat, so please just call me out if you want a POI. Okay, I'm gonna start speaking in 3, 2, 1. Before I respond to anything that the previous speaker said, I would just like to go back to the motion and talk about what this is really about. The motion literally states that the narrative that we are supposed to be against as opening opposition is the narrative that love is necessary for a marriage, which means to say that you have to be in love with somebody before you marry them. This means that what opening government is literally supposed supposed to defend is a world in which you are going to marry somebody without love being present in the first place, right? This means to say that if I am somebody who's interested in marrying that other person, it means to say that I am going to glorify other aspects of our relationship, such as whether or not I will get money, such as whether or not I think this is my way out of poverty, as opposed to whether or not this person actually loves me. And this is where the misunderstanding took place between opening government and opening opposition. Opening government ran cases that essentially defended that love is not the most important thing in a marriage. However, they're burdened to defend that love is necessary for a marriage to take place. And because of that, I have two very important rebuttals for you today. The first thing is that the previous speaker said love is where they disagree that love is where your needs are essentially being met. This means to say that they described love as if it is something that people define for themselves and it is not something inherently objective. However, we disagree coming from opening opposition. I think it's because people commonly know when they're being loved and when they are not being loved based on how they feel and based on how they are being treated. This is why social norms happen, and this is why we spend our time with certain people. Simply because if I don't feel good with this person, it means to say that I probably don't love them and I'm not going to spend time with them. As opposed to when I'm spending time with another person, which they make me feel nice, I probably love them, and that's why I'm going to spend time with them. We think it's this natural human trait to be able to feel emotions with regards to how other people act towards you. We think that that's the standard for what love is. What government is trying to paint to you is when people defend something that is not necessarily love. We think that objectively hitting your partner is not love. We think objectively cursing out your partner is not love. We think that abuse is abuse, and we think that it's nobody's burden in this debate to be able to defend that. And because of that, we think that their harms are essentially moot, and we think that love is something that we defend coming from opening opposition. Second rebuttal to the previous speaker. They told you that you are more likely to leave a loveless marriage on their side of the house. But why do we think this is false? We think that if your narrative is that you don't necessarily have to be in love with somebody to be able to marry them, we think that you're more likely to stay in that marriage because society tells you it's okay if your husband doesn't love you. For instance, if your husband is beating you up every day, or for instance, your husband is cursing you out every day, we think that there's no social pressure to be able to stop that because love isn't something that is necessary under the marriages within government's world, right? We think that then the stakes are even higher coming from government bench, in which people don't have the social pressure to be able to see love in a marriage to be able to root for it. And because of that, we think that abuse is actually further worse off on their side of the house. And with that, I have two extensions for you today. On to my first extension. We think that in a world without love as a necessary condition for marriage, people are more likely to be psychologically abused and unsatisfied with their life because they are economically underprivileged. Let's contextualize what we mean by this. We think that the most important stakeholder in this debate are the economically underprivileged individuals because they essentially feel the brunt of marriage as a way to be able to get out of poverty, but at the same time, it is also the vehicle people use to be able to abuse them. Why is this so? This is because marriages are essentially treated as a means to get out of poverty as opposed to a means to be able to love somebody, right? At the end of the day, marriage is simplified as a contract on government's house as opposed to a lifelong partnership with someone that actually takes into account all the human aspects that are important when you are entering a partnership with somebody. This is worse off on government's house because of two things. Number one, in terms of how the poor is exploited, and number two, how women have no agency on government bench. But let's talk about the first consideration, about how the poor is further exploited on government bench. We think that if society believes that love is not necessary for marriage, then it is much easier to exploit the poor for marriage. We agree with government bench that marriage is used as a solution to people's economic problems, but we think that people marry someone of an upper social class rather in order to help their family socially mobilize, and sometimes the family arranges these marriages themselves. However, we know that exploitation exists in status quo, and we think that it's even worse off on government bench when you remove the narrative that love is necessary for marriage. Because in a world in which love is not necessary for marriage, there's no moral or social pressure to protect children from being sold off or married off to wealthy men as a means to alleviate someone from poverty. We think that the harm there is that it's easier to normalize child brides, child pregnancies, and also normalize women not having control over the course of their own lives because marriage isn't that important. Marriage isn't about love at the end of the day. This is because you completely disregard the emotional impact of marriage towards the mental health and self-actualization of women, and we think you diminish what it means to be somebody's lifelong partner regardless of their economic status. It is better on opening opposition then, because in our status quo, which we defend, society disagrees when marriages aren't out of love. They verbally disagree when marriages just take place just because, and it doesn't necessarily have love in that. And we think that that's where social pressure is actually a good thing. We think it's obvious whenever people are forced to marry for money, and the feminist movement works towards putting an end to these marriage contracts because women in these relationships are abused and are not really loved. On our side of the house, we at least have an incentive to put an end to marriage exploitation and have a better option for people to be uplifted from poverty, such as welfare, non-governmental organizations for women, etc. We think we would rather have that social pressure rather than none. Let's talk about the second consideration, which is how women have no agency on government's house. We think that on our side of the house, we are okay with idealizing love as such a high standard because we don't want anybody to settle for less. We think that whenever people disregard their natural human nature not to prioritize love, people are likely to settle for less than what they deserve. We think that they can marry for the sake of convenience or for the sake of pleasing the family, and this is even more harmful because you remove people's personal incentive to fight for who they want to spend their lives with, and you make people even more vulnerable to abuse on opening government. We think that this is where you literally gaslight women into thinking that being somebody's lifelong partner is not necessary for love. It means to say that love isn't necessary for somebody to essentially be a second half of you or like to be a second like lifetime partner. And we think that that's something that diminishes the value of women, and we think that that's something that diminishes the value of human connection as a whole. And we think that on opening opposition, that's much better because at least we don't create this like diminished value of communication with in between people. Second extension, really quickly, we think on opening opposition, you are more likely to improve communication and create meaningful relationships to that. Because on the comparative, on opening government, you literally can stay in a loveless marriage without talking because love isn't necessary to be able to stay married, right? However, on our side of the house, on love, we are able to find love when, and it's very clear when it's not love because you are not communicating with other people. This is where you lessen trauma from children because it is very much clear when society is against a marriage that is clearly not for love and it's clearly abusive. Never been prouder to protect the vulnerable. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. That ends the top half debate. Now the pick up the back half debate. Maybe have the member of Gov. Also, member of Gov, note that we are still being recorded. So if you do not consent, please do verbally mention that you don't do so, and the recording will immediately be stopped.
I'm audible.
You're audible.
Okay. I'll start in 3.
Just a second, member. Do you consent to being recorded or not?
I'm fine with it. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. In a world where other emotions and factors are as important as love, this believes that love can still be a factor but unnecessary in a marriage. So firstly, just want to get onto some rebuttals. OO's main primary argument is that people will marry across wealth gaps instead, and thus women will remain in abusive relationships if they marry for other reasons other than wealth. For example, wealth, there'll be more abuse and violence that comes from economic disparity in society. Well, I just want to say that people don't often marry across financial divides often, and this is a small impact of best because of the small numbers of marriages like this that do happen. And the reasons why this is unlikely and therefore a small impact are because of 4 reasons. Firstly, social circles in society don't mix, right? For example, in the workplaces, in the restaurants and hobbies, right, ones that you can afford. For example, if I work in a high-end firm, if I go to expensive restaurants, if I live in a high-class area, I'm surrounded by people who are of the same class. It's harder for me to meet people who are of a lower class than me, right? Or same vice versa, which means that it's harder for people to meet, right, from different classes in the first place, which means that overall these marriages are going to be hard find come across. Secondly, rich families don't want their children to marry into poor families. It's just a fact, right? They don't want to share their assets and wealth. They want to increase their wealth and status, continuously by marrying into richer families or marrying into the same social class with the same hierarchy. People value their opinions of their families a lot and thus want to get inheritance, so they must be on their parents' good side, which means they're most likely, if they do meet a person that is of a lower class, the likelihood of marriage is lower. Thirdly, it is frowned upon to marry because of money, right? For example, in society, gold diggers are called out, and even if they do, they don't get the status or recognition knowing that they have married up to get where they are from society in the first place, which means it's more likely not to happen. And finally, behavior rich have signals that they follow to show that they're rich, right? I mean, people who are inherently rich are well-groomed, are well-educated, and read. They have table manners, they have high class of fashion, and they spend money on less flashy things than the new rich, right? Than the new rich, which buy like expensive cars, expensive houses. So people who are married into the rich families will be seen as not really belonging there because they can't keep up with these standards, and this happens the majority of the time. Which means that the occasion of marriage into a higher social and economical class is rare, and thus the impacts of O bring in the entire case is minimal. And this is only one instantation of marriages that are not based on primary of love, right? There's still many instances of marriages that do not involve wealth, that do not involve love, like for example, as OG mentioned, compatibility or other aspects of life, right? So it's like their second rebuttal is that they said women have no agency and they marry for the sake of convenience, and thus this leads to more abusive marriages again, right? This marrying and lowering standards occurs more often in opposition because, as this optimistic Hollywood-like society where people, marry people because of love, right? And less factors are taken into account, for instance, right? Because they're marrying into love, right? Because they're so desperate to, marry people because for the sake of love, right? Young people, less factors are taken into account, which means overall, this abuse, this toxic relationship environment is going to occur more, which I'll elaborate on my first point. So later. So we support that this marriage is still mostly a condition that's taken into account, but it's unnecessary, right? People can still marry for love that they want to, if they want to. This is a preferred motion. So I'll have to defend the status quo, where in most places people prioritize love as a primary condition to marry, and we have to defend the hypothetical world that people base their decisions to marry on a wider range of factors that they weigh up, including love, right? The problem in the status quo is that where people value love as a primary condition to marry, it overshadows other reasons. Even when it doesn't make logical sense, they still do, right? Another outcome is that people don't marry when it does make sense, since it marry one person, since they can marry one person, and these are like mutually exclusive, right? Marriage is more transactional and calculated on our side, and that's not a bad thing to explain further, and it results in healthier marriage. It allows for wider considerations of other factors, such as compatibility, such as career trajectory, such as finances, such as other emotions that's still important in marriage, such as happiness, right? So the most likely outcome on our side is that there's less people marrying spontaneously without considering other factors that are as important, and they're less abusive and toxic marriages. So the main point that we make are that we get healthier relationships that are more sustainable, right? Love is overall a short-lived emotion. It dies down. These are hormones that are according hormones that build up throughout a short period of time, and they're not accurate representations of personalities. So these factors could change over time, so the emotion dies down. It's natural for people to grow apart and separate, and it's natural for these emotions to change from passion to one that is based on familiarity and comfort, which means that people enter marriages wanting love because it's what attracts them to the relationships in the first place, right? It's a selection bias. So when this is not fulfilled in the long term, they're most likely to harbor negative feelings of resentment, jealousy, and insecurities that express themselves in arguments or fights or attention or distance or cheat, for example, etc., right? And this doesn't happen for our marriages, but this is most likely to happen when people base their decisions off love. In addition, people have based their decisions on less compatible on other decisions, and therefore there are less likely to be areas of compatibility to sustain the relationships in the long term, such as career prospects aligning and reinforcing each other. This means that there are a lot of considerable number of marriages that start off with passionate love, but because of this fading love, right, not considering other factors, it causes the following above, right? OO says that love is needed to maintain a well-being of children, but we showed this from this mechanism above, that when love fades, more often than not, it is when a marriage and when love fades, it's more often than not, a marriage is only built on the fleeting and short-term passionate love. It creates a toxic, unhealthy environment for the partners and possible children affected. Before I go into my impacts, I'll take PY from OO.
You're supposed to defend a world in which love isn't necessary for marriage. On our side, that's okay. If you don't love them anymore, you can just divorce them. On your side, they're likely to stay without loving the other person. That's worse, right?
No. I'll go into my impacts right now, which will explain why even staying together and separating on government side is going to be worse, right? Because of this toxic narrative, right? So this plays out in two ways. If there's a toxic narrative built on because of this fading love that we just explained above, right? There are two ways this this plays out. Either people will stay together or separate. When they stay together, this is bad because couples have an unhealthy relationship, right? For instance, children grow up in a home that is more likely to be characterized by toxic and abusive behavior. Children who grow up in this destructive environment get less healthy parenting because parents are more likely to undermine each other, right? For example, if one supports discipline through positive reinforcement and healthy discussions, and another undermines with a firm-handed approach that does not foster discussion, but rather dictates the child behavior and uses punishment. When parents are on the same page, it means worse parenting, and children who lack love and guidance are more likely to fall into youth delinquency, which is explained above, and which means that secondly, divorces often lead to often a process that is highly inconvenient. When people marry for love, they're expected not to take it as a transactional and logical thing, right? They're more likely to share assets in a weak prenuptial agreements, which makes divorce less attractive in the first place, and trapping people in toxic relationships and making divorces something that has a huge negative impact on all parties, right? This means that all this leads to intergenerational trauma that's widely prevalent today because of this toxic parent relationship. As a child, right, in an environment that's toxic and harmful, they fight and abusive, right? Parents are unhappy and more likely to abuse their children. So overall, like O said, there's going to be more unhappy and carry on the traits of the parents, which means the impact that they have listed and their argument are more likely going to affect this. In comparison, our relationships are based on less arbitrary, more practical factors to a greater degree. This is why we are proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. May we have the member proposition?
Hello, this is Ian speaking. Could I please check if I can be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
Cool. In that case, I'll start my speech very soon. POI is in the chat, yeah? The main problem with the opening exchange in this particular debate is that neither side tried to prove the counterfactual. OG asserted that actually your marriage endeavor will be based on compatibility and your ability to get material benefits. So, for example, you want to get tax breaks. O asserts that marriage will be entirely based on material benefit and no love at all. CO, the problem with that is that you then, as a judge, have no ability to weigh one over the other. So either it's the best case scenario or worst case scenario. You don't know who to give it to at this point. Let's be honest. The reason why CO will take this debate for the opposition bench, especially for CO, is because we will explain the counterfactual. We will explain why in the vast majority of societies, before marriage was made contingent on love, marriages were a lot of times non-consensual for the women especially. And we will explain why consent to a marriage in particular is the most important element in this debate. So firstly, a couple of points of context. When exactly did marriage actually become consensual and become based on love? We think marriage specifically became based on love in the 1950s. If you want to take a look at like OG's war and CG's war, you only really have to look at 100 years before now, right? When individuals, before we're talking about marriage being a structure of love, we look at Victorian or Renaissance era, where marriage was based on familial benefit. We look at traditional societies where women are more often than not match made, for example, by their family members. And the reason for this is simple. It is because oftentimes, especially in patriarchal societies, but in societies more broadly, the autonomy of women is neglected. That is to say that women's autonomy is superseded by factors like material benefit for the family. When the family needs to do things like unite with another family, for example, or be able to access things like a dowry, for example, or they just need someone to take up the material cost of taking care of their kid because they don't want to be able to send their kid to education because it's costly, so why not let the husband take care of it anyway? We also see scenarios where doing so is just practically beneficial for the parent because they're able to get the status out of having a kid married. Therefore, in all of these circumstances, women do have their autonomy neglected, right? The reason why this is a likely counterfactual is because absent a world whereby love is the main yardstick for marriage, or love is a precedent for marriage, society is likely to default to things that were there before, things that love necessarily fights against. Why then would people marry in the government world? People would likely marry because of, as they said, material security. But it doesn't material security like you don't have to pay tax. It's material security that your husband takes a job and pays for you and pays out all your living costs, and you don't have to get an education as a result. It is things like you paying a large dowry to their family members, especially in less developed countries where this is more common as a norm in the status quo. We will say, therefore, love as a counterfactual to this is able to beat back against these narratives and take over. Why is this the case? And this is why I mechanize actually the counterfactual from the opposition bench. The main reason why love as a factor against this is because you are the only one who has access to whether you love someone or not. That is to say, no one else can tell you that you love them unless you tell them that you love them. For example, you cannot tell your parents cannot tell you you love like me, for example. That's not possible, right? Because in order for you to be able to say I love them, it is something that you necessarily come up to by yourself. But this is a debate winning extension, because at the end of the day, government benches ideas still rely on autonomy. But if I can prove to you that autonomy is necessarily contingent on love as a factor, that means we take over them and take the counterfactuals as well. Furthermore, on a legal level, the ability to tell individuals that you love them is something that you necessarily have for yourself. So if marriage is legally contingent on you telling them that you love them, or on a religious level contingent on you telling them you love them, that's necessarily something that only individuals can do rather than your family or rather than the society around you. Therefore, it's far more likely to happen on our side. I'll take that POI.
Yeah, so we no longer live in the Renaissance era. Presumably, in our retrospective world, feminism would still push for greater agency and empowerment for women as well. But this also does not deal with the fact that women still feel pressured in your world.
Oh yeah, excellent. So the reason why love necessarily adds onto that social movement and like capitalizes on it is because love as a narrative fits into the narrative movement. So for example, your ability to your ability as a feminist to fight for things gets more traction at the point in which you're able to provide them with that romantic idea of love, of marriage as leading love, right? So sure, the marriage. So sure, in a world whereby this didn't happen, the feminist movement might still fight for this, but love gives you far more traction. So we don't have to get an absolute in our world, but in our world, we get far more individuals who are in consensual marriages. That's why, for example, on a gut instinct level, we know that children cannot get married because they cannot possibly be loving that old guy who just gives their parents a lot of money, right? That's why on our side of the house, we're able to galvanize around these things far better than your work, but these things were not galvanized around therefore. So why exactly is it that it is so bad in the government world? A couple of reasons. Number one, you did not choose the person you marry. You likely did not have a say in it because your family is likely the one who selected them based on their material compatibility. Notice that material compatibility has nothing to do with actual compatibility, right? So for example, this person could be really rich but also an asshole because that's how rich people often are, right? We will say that oftentimes that leads towards you coming into scenarios where there's a big age gap, for example, or you're materially not, or your personalities do not coincide a lot. In all of these instances, you as a person do not choose this person, but furthermore, you become dependent on them the point at which you're married primarily for material considerations. So sure, in the government benches work, as an individual ends up marrying because they need it, but that leads towards individuals becoming materially desperate and relying on them. So if you're, for example, marrying to a person who then becomes a breadwinner, the point at which you want to leave that relationship is the point at which you leave your income as well, you leave your house as well. All of these things are things that you necessarily lose out on the government bench. On the opposition bench, at least we can tell you that individuals are not able to, if you marry into someone for love, you're far more likely to then take precautions for yourself and be able to guide yourself in that scenario. Furthermore, we also point out that parents are in the government world are more likely to neglect their female children because they believe that they can be taken care of materially by other people, which generally is how marriage works, or the social function that marriage serves in the world without the idea of love. When you're outside, I think it's better. A couple of reasons. Number one, we are able to ensure that parents it's just far more arbitrary whether you fall in love with someone or not. But that's a good thing, right? If you don't know whether you fall in love with someone or your kid will fall in love with someone, that means you better guard just in case they end up not doing it. But furthermore, the fact that I don't love them becomes an additional tool by which you can claim that you do not opt into this marriage because no one can tell you that you love someone aside from yourself. But thirdly, and this is super important, we get individual autonomy. And the reason why autonomy is so important in this scenario because it's your only ability to conceptualize of yourself. We will pick your own identity and pursue the love that you actually, to pursue love as something that you actually get legitimized by society. Because in government benches, well, individuals will still fall in love, right? It's just that they'll never be able to marry the people they love because more often than not, they're marrying someone because of compatibility or because of material benefit. But the exact same reason that we regret that gay people cannot get married in many societies, or that interracial marriage is illegal in certain societies and claiming it to be such a bad thing, often comparable to situations of material deprivation, is because you deprive individuals of the autonomy over who you marry. Therefore, in this circumstance as well, you should prioritize your autonomy as an individual far, far more than all of these other material considerations. At the end of the day, closing opposition is the team who should take this debate because the debate essentially swings on which counterfactual you believe. We're the ones who explain why you should believe our counterfactual, we take it.
I thank the speaker for that speech. We now have the Gov Whip. Note that the Gov Whip does not consent to be recorded.
Right? Even if it is, it's not a right because, cool. Even if it is, it's not a right because the commitment in any dual relationship is dual consent. That is to say that we don't necessarily think that the idea of the fact is hard to find love. We don't care because independent of that, the right to consenting to a relationship isn't something that's more important. The second, right, is that it's very and the second response to the fact is very spontaneous. Yes, motion assumes that people have a bunch of immutable like things that they want in a relationship, right? And love is confirmed to be one of them. But there's also a bunch of things as well that you can love someone, but if you realize that you materially are not compatible with them, you can still cut them off, right? That is to say, it's not mutually exclusive, right? There's a bunch of criteria that love is not the be all end all, but it is still an essential criteria to our side of the house. I don't necessarily think this is very contentious. Lastly, they say India. Great, good that you pointed out. On our side, even in the conservative parts of India, you have to go on dates. You have to make dating profiles. You have to make match.com things, because in the fact is that if you want, like, it is part of the transaction right now. That is to say, on our side of the house, love is something that you have to take into account when you want to marry a woman. The counterfactual on their side of the house is that in India right now, you don't have to do any of it. You just go, daughter, you are getting married the next day. Very good. Bye-bye. Right? That is the counterfactual that you have to defend. Right? On our side of the house, we can still have those particular safeguards. Never responded to. What is the extension therefore? The extension therefore is, and in both terms, a vertical one in terms of mechanization of why specifically is abusive. Ian gives you two things. Also, very quickly, note therefore, the frame in this debate is not about people who can access love already. This debate is about people who cannot access love. Engaging with TJs like POI right now, that means the patriarchy still exists, right? Because what we are essentially saying is that firstly, this feeds into the patriarchy. So on our side, and marriage is an institution that's notorious for feeding into patriarchy. But more than that, it also exists independent of women's rights movements. That is to say, TJ, that like unfortunately, women's rights movement haven't solved the patriarchy. We are saying it wasn't on your side of the house. Cool. Note then that the lower barriers to entry to marriage means that material things matter more. This is engaged on both OG and CG. Intuitively, more marriages of conveniences are based on other things as well. The unique difference, therefore, is the autonomy to be able to force. It's something that OO doesn't point out. One, why is it that like marriage without love means that consent is violated? Sorry. Oh, the first is patriarchy, right? Why you're marrying is because the specific gender role that means that men should provide means that women often have to play the passive role that the person within a relationship is expected to provide. The second is that the external like pressures to marry means that women oftentimes are unfortunately unable to marry independent against your will, right? Historically, finding a partner to your family is something that brings honor and respect. On a more banal level, gets you more wealth and prosperous, right? And prosperous stuff. So that necessarily means when you don't marry, you get like faced with heavy sanction. And an example of this is just like in Chinese culture, right? Where like unmarried women are compared to like spilled, like discarded water. Cool. Why is it important? Why is autonomy likely to be better? I mean, likely to be worse on their side of the house. Firstly, on the individual level, it cements the fact that without that barrier, you're entitled to the body of a woman. The issue of a transactional relationship here is not the fact it's just purely transactional, because all love is transactional, but it's the fact that this transaction specifically buys your autonomy, buys your rights, right? The fact that I pay for your meal means I have sex with you tonight. The fact that I am necessarily that I pay for that particular, like that hotel room, right, means that you have to kiss me every day, right? That particular infringement, or I take away all your rights. This infringement, is hard to opt out of, especially if you're in a third world country, but more importantly, it's still major considerations that you have to think about when you want to leave a relationship, right? The second, you're unlikely to be happy to the point in which you are tied down because of these like particular conditions is to the point in which that your own individual autonomy cannot be actualized. The only which you can be happy is if your goals align, which unfortunately, guys, how do your goals align? You talk to the individual and believe you love them. Cool. Before I move on, yeah, I take CG.
Yeah, so you opt claims that love is a human need. Can you explain why people can't get love from their children, parents, and friends sufficiently that they don't have to enter a low compatibility and abusive relationship that women can't opt out of meaningfully?
So women are also abusive on your side of the house, and we can also get them to access children and stuff. You have to access marriage also. Cool. Like this is a very funny POI. I love that for you. The scale of removal of autonomy is more important versus OO, because OO says abuse. Thank you. Abuse very vague, right? Because how the abuse is something that is very important in terms of you knowing judge, how specifically to adjudicate a loss of autonomy. But more importantly, there's harms independent of abuse. So let's take them at best case, and this is what Ian also specifically does in weighing, right? Even if it works out, the selling of the autonomy of an individual legitimizes the outcome. The sacrificing of your autonomy for material things means that you allow yourself to be sold to, that you as an individual are willing to sell your life, your people, your own individual autonomy to do things like make friends, I don't know, sing, right? The reason why we live panel is because us as individuals have goals in life, aspirations, things that we want to do ourselves. This includes the people we let in and the people we let out, right? I think that like the comparative on the other side of the house is that they legitimize things like, for example, allowing yourself to be sold to slavery. You do get material benefit. You do get some form of recourse. You do get money, presumably maybe quite a lot. The issue here is that you're beholden to someone else's whims and fancies. The issue here is that you're not a product and a property of someone else. The issue here is you're likely to be unhappy because of it. I think that's extremely deplorable. OG, therefore, and why they probably lose this debate. The main thrust of this argument, I think we win over OG firstly by the pure virtue that we don't argue on like, what's that thing called? Abuse, right? Because OG and O specifically put the frame of abuse. Abuse can happen like independent. That is to say that like there's a whole bunch of reasons why we can be abusive, right? But I think independent, even if it doesn't turn out abusive, I think on our side of the house, it is still principally unjustified, right? More importantly, like it's also like OG also like spends a lot of time on like love is very fragile. Yes, material things also like it's not mutually exclusive, right? That is to say that like if love is very fragile, material things are also very fragile. Like these are these are things that can easily like disappear in an instant. I think on the point in which we protect the autonomy of women on our side of the house is when we probably win this debate.